I remember the singing. That's what comes back to me first, even before the faces sometimes, the sound of it, rolling down a country road in France like something alive. It was a different war then, a different world. We were young, and the sun seemed to be always shining on our Feldgrau uniforms. The leather of our boots was still supple and hadn't cracked, and we sang because we had victory in our blood. It was Erica then, or Westerwald, voices strong, in time with the tramp of our boots on the hard-packed earth. You felt it in your chest, that rhythm, a vibration that tied you to the man in front and the man behind. It was a shield, that sound, a wall of noise we built around ourselves against any thought of doubt or fear. We were invincible because we were a single, roaring beast, and the songs were its breath. We'd march through villages, and the people would just watch, silent, and our singing would get even louder, a boast, a proclamation. We were the masters of this new Europe, or so they told us, and in those days, with the sun on the barrel of my rifle and the easy weight of my pack, I believed it. We all did. The future was a bright, clear road leading straight to glory and then back home, heroes all. We'd share cigarettes, my buddy Klaus and I, and he'd joke that his wife would barely recognize him with all the medals he'd have to pin on his tunic. That's the man I was then, a man who could still think of medals and parades. Then they put us on the trains east, and east kept going. You'd fall asleep looking out at a forest of birch trees and wake up hours later, and it was the same damn forest, just more of it. Russia. It's a word that doesn't sound like a country. It sounds like an exhaustion. The distances there, they don't make sense to a European mind. They swallow you. And the songs began to change. It wasn't a sudden thing. At first, it was just that we'd sing a little less loudly on the march. The gusto, as they say, started to leak out of us. The rhythms began to falter. Your feet weren't stepping in time to a song anymore. The song was trying and failing to keep pace with the dragging, weary slog of your feet. The dust of those summer roads got into everything: your throat, your eyes, the mechanism of your rifle. It was a fine, yellow powder that tasted of despair. You'd try to sing, and you'd end up coughing, spitting out a paste of dirt and phlegm. The melodies became mechanical, a habit, like cleaning your rifle, something you did because you were supposed to, not because your heart was in it. The words started to feel hollow, like we were ghosts chanting a liturgy from a religion we didn't believe in anymore. Victory didn't mean parades in Berlin anymore. It meant reaching the next burned-out village a few hours before dusk, finding a cellar that wasn't flooded, maybe a few potatoes that the partisans had missed. The shield was cracking. You could feel the cold seeping in through the cracks long before the first snows fell. Then the cold came. My God, the cold. It's a living thing, the Russian winter. It doesn't just surround you, it invades you. It climbs inside your lungs with every breath, a sharp, crystalline pain. It settles in your bones until you feel like you're carrying a skeleton of ice. Your breath would freeze on the wool of your scarf, forming a stiff mask of ice around your mouth. And singing became impossible. It was a physical impossibility. To sing, you need air, deep from your belly, but each lungful was a knife. The notes would die in your throat, choked off by the cold. The steam from your mouth, the little puff of life heat, was more precious than any melody. We'd march in a silence broken only by the endless crunch of snow under our boots, the creak of the gun carriage wheels, and the rattling coughs of the men. That's when the silence began, not as a choice, but as a necessity for survival. You conserved every ounce of energy, every calorie of warmth. The songs became a memory of a different climate, a different body that still felt warm. I remember one night, huddled in a dugout with a few of the boys from my company, a kid from Hamburg, couldn't have been more than 18, started to hum a Christmas carol. It was still knacked, Silent Night. He hummed just a few bars, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely keep the tune. And in the darkness, someone else, an older man, a sergeant with a face like worn leather, just said, "Save your breath, son. The cold will take it anyway." And the humming stopped. Silence that followed was heavier than the frozen earth above our heads. Then came Stalingrad. The name alone is a curse. If Russia was exhaustion, Stalingrad was damnation. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a skeleton of a city, a jagged outline of rubble against a sky perpetually stained with smoke. There were no streets, just paths through the debris, corridors of collapsed buildings where you'd have to climb over piles of brick and twisted metal that might have been a home or a factory once. And the noise. The noise erased the very possibility of song. It was an industrial symphony of horror. The constant, stomach-churning crunch of artillery shells, ours and theirs, the stuttering, manic rhythm of the MG-42, the higher-pitched bark of the Russian PPSH SMGS that we called the Pepesha, the screams of the wounded that would echo through the ruins and then cut off abruptly. You lived in a world of sound that was meant only to kill. In that place, the idea of singing felt obscene. It would have been a betrayal of the men bleeding out in a cellar, of the starved, hollow faces of your comrades, of the sheer, utter horror that every moment had become. I saw a man try once. It was in a bunker near the Red October factory, a former storage cellar that stank of damp earth, cordite, and the faint, sweet smell of gangrene. A young lieutenant, his uniform caked in filth, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic energy, tried to rally us. "Come on, men, a song. Let them hear us. Izitten die Morschen Nachen," he started singing, his voice cracking on the high notes, about how the rotten bones of the world tremble before the coming storm. We just stared at him. The other men, gaunt and shadows of their former selves, just looked at him with a kind of vacant exhaustion. There was no contempt, just a profound, bottomless pity. He was singing about a world that no longer existed, a confidence that had been ground into the dust of this city. It was a ghost trying to remind the living of what life felt like. He stopped after a few lines, his voice trailing off into the oppressive silence, which was now filled with the distant thud of a mortar round and the drip-drip-drip of water somewhere. That was the last time I heard anyone try to sing in Stalingrad. The pocket closed around us. The sky, when you could see it, was full of the sound of Russian planes, the deep-throated rumble of their engines, a sound we called Stalin's organs. We were trapped. Food became a memory. A slice of hard black bread was a feast. You'd see men scraping the gelatinous grease from the inside of a tank track cover just for the calories. We were starving, freezing, and being shelled to pieces. The songs weren't just forgotten. They were a relic from a life we had been forcibly evicted from. The man who sang Erica on the road to Paris was a stranger to me, a boy I barely remembered. Here, in this hell, you were reduced to your most basic elements: cold, hunger, fear, and if you were lucky, a tiny, stubborn flicker of will to see the sun rise one more time. Comradeship wasn't about singing together anymore. It was about sharing the last drops of water from your canteen, taking a 2-hour watch for a buddy who was too weak to stand, holding a man's hand as he died because there was nothing else you could do. That was the real music, the silent language of men who knew they were doomed. The dark humor was the only melody we had left. Someone would crack a joke about the quality of the Stalingrad steak, which was a piece of stale bread, and for a second you'd almost smile. It was a way of spitting in death's eye. The end, when it came, wasn't a battle, it was a collapse. The order came down the shattered chain of command. Break out. It wasn't a retreat. There were no lines to retreat to. It was every man for himself, a desperate, hopeless scramble to try and reach the German lines miles to the west. That was the beginning of the long walk. I was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it that. I had a wound, a shrapnel tear in my leg that was ugly but not immediately fatal, and it got me onto one of the last evacuation planes from Gumrak Airfield, a nightmare ride in a shuddering Ju-52 through flak and fighters. But others, thousands of others, had to walk. And those who did it, they carried the silence with them. I heard stories later, from the handful of broken souls who made it through. They spoke of a column of ghosts, stumbling through the snow, a procession of the damned. There were no songs. The only sounds were the crunch of frost under the remains of their boots, the rattling of their breath, the occasional bone-shaking cough that could be a death sentence, and always, always, the thunder of the Russian guns behind them, growing slowly closer. They said there was an unspoken agreement, understanding that passed between the survivors without a single word being exchanged. The songs, the confident marches, the anthems of victory, those belonged to the men we used to be. And those men were dead, buried under the snow and rubble of Stalingrad. To sing one of those songs now would be to dishonor their memory, to pretend that any of it had meant something. The silence was the only thing that felt honest. It was heavy, yes, a weight on your shoulders as tangible as your pack, but it was a shared weight. It was our new marching song. It was a hymn to the dead, a ballad of loss, and it spoke more truth about what we had become than any string of words ever could. That silence has never really left me. Even now, decades later, sitting in a warm room, I can still hear it. It's the sound of Stalingrad. It's the sound of the boy I was, learning that he was not invincible. It's the sound of a heart that almost forgot how to hope. We stopped singing because we finally understood the war, and some truths are too heavy for a melody. The train ride east was a long, rattling nightmare of soot and cold drafts, but we were too green to know it. We were replacements, fresh out of training camp at Derberitz, our faces still soft, our boots barely broken in, our heads stuffed with nonsense. To calm the nervous fluttering in my gut, I'd hum the marching songs under my breath. Erika, Panzerlied, the good, sturdy tunes that had been the soundtrack to our drilling. They made us feel connected to something bigger, this grand, singing army we'd seen in the newsreels, an unstoppable force of disciplined men bound together by melody and purpose. The other new fellows, Klaus, and the young kid we called Fünfminute, because everything he did took 5 minutes too long. They'd join in sometimes, our voices a thin, reedy chorus against the clatter of the wheels on the tracks. We were heading towards the brotherhood of the front, and we imagined it would be just like camp, only with more excitement and glory. We were such fools. The first cold water on that idea was the sergeant who met our detail at the end of the line. He wasn't what I expected. He looked like he'd been carved from old leather and left out in the rain for a decade. His uniform was caked in a pale, dusty grime, and his eyes, God, his eyes didn't seem to see you at all. They looked right through you, like he was staring at some awful memory just over your shoulder. We shuffled off the train, stretching our stiff legs, and I, trying to show some spirit, started up a few bars of a song to get us marching in step towards the front. The sergeant turned those dead eyes on me, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. "Save your breath for walking, boy," he grunted, his voice a dry rasp, "and for staying alive. The only music out here is the artillery symphony, and you won't care for the finale." We fell into a confused, silent line behind him. That was my first lesson, walking through that sea of mud they called a road, the air thick with the stink of damp earth, cordite, and something else, something sweet and rotten I couldn't place yet. The sergeant didn't say another word the whole way. When we reached the company positions, it was like stepping into a village of ghosts. These were the veterans, the men who had been at Stalingrad. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like old men playing dress-up in filthy rags. Their faces were hollowed out, their gazes empty as abandoned windows. They moved with a slow, weary economy, every motion calculated to conserve energy. There was no banter, no laughter, just a heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the distant thump of the guns. I tried to make myself useful to fit in. That evening, as we huddled in a dugout, the damp cold seeping into our bones, I thought maybe a song would lift their spirits, remind them of who we were. I started softly, "Vor der Kassen, vor dem großen Tor." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight. A veteran across from me, a man with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, slowly turned his head. He didn't glare, he didn't shout. He just looked at me with a bottomless, weary contempt, and then spat into the dirt between his boots. The message was clearer than any reprimand. I shut my mouth, my face burning with a shame I didn't fully understand. I was an outsider, a child who didn't speak the language of this new, silent army I'd been assigned to. The brotherhood I'd imagined was a myth. Here, the only thing binding these men together was a shared exhaustion and a history of horrors I couldn't even fathom. The real education came a few nights later. It started with the sudden, terrifying shriek of incoming mortar fire, the frantic shout of the sentry. The world dissolved into chaos flashes of light that blinded you, the crump of explosions that punched the air from your lungs, the zip and whine of shrapnel cutting through the darkness. We tumbled out of our holes, fumbling with our rifles, our hearts hammering against our ribs. I was pure panic, all training forgotten, just a raw nerve of fear. But the veterans, they were different. I saw them moving through the madness not like men, but like shadows. No shouting, no wasted motion. A sharp, low hiss from the sergeant, a hand signal I barely recognized, and a fire team would flank left. A tug on a sleeve, a pointing finger, and a machine gun would open up from a new position. They communicated in this silent language of survival, their movements fluid and precise. I stumbled forward, my boots slipping in the mud, and a hand grabbed my tunic collar, yanking me down into a waterlogged shell hole just as a burst of machine gun fire stitched the air where my chest had been. It was the scar-faced veteran. He didn't look at me. His eyes were scanning the lip of the crater, his rifle steady. In that moment, crouched in the freezing water, the smell of wet wool and terror thick in my nose, I finally understood. The songs, the noise, the bravado, it was all a death sentence. In this world, sound was a target. Silence wasn't a lack of spirit, it was a weapon. It was the hard-earned wisdom of men who had learned that to make a noise was to invite death, and that survival depended on a quiet, desperate vigilance. That silence was the real discipline, the true mark of a soldier who knew his business. After that night, something in me changed. I started paying attention. I watched how the veterans cleaned their weapons, a slow, ritualistic process they performed with a religious devotion. I saw how they dug their foxholes, deep and narrow, always adding little improvements like a drainage trench or an overhead cover of logs and dirt. I learned to listen to the sounds of the front, different thumps of outgoing and incoming artillery, the cough of a mortar, the specific rustle that might be a rat or might be an enemy patrol. I stopped trying to fill the silence with meaningless chatter and started embracing it. The transformation was slow, a gradual shedding of my training-based skin. There was a dark humor that occasionally surfaced, the kind that would seem ghastly anywhere else. Like when Fünfminute finally got his wish for a deeper hole after a near miss and joked that he'd trade his cigarette ration for a shovel that didn't bend. We'd de-laugh, a short, sharp bark, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. The homesickness was a constant, low ache, a dull pain you carried with you like a stone in your pocket. You'd see a man staring at a creased, water-stained photograph of his wife or children, and you knew not to say a word. That was a private sanctuary, a silent communion with a world that no longer felt real. Then came the moment I knew I'd been accepted. We were waiting in a forward listening post before dawn, the cold so deep it felt like your bones were made of ice. Everything was still, the world holding its breath. I was scanning my sector, my senses stretched taut, every muscle tense. I heard a faint, unnatural scrape off to the left. I didn't shout. I didn't move my head. I slowly reached out and tapped the sergeant's arm twice, then pointed with 2 fingers, the way I'd seen him do it. He froze, listened for a long moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod. He turned his head just enough to look at me, and in the grey pre-dawn light I saw it. A single, slow nod of approval, no smile, no words, but in that gesture was everything. It said, "You're learning, you might just make it." That silent acknowledgement meant more to me than any chorus of marching songs ever could. I finally got it. This was the new brotherhood. It wasn't built on shared songs or patriotic hymns. It was forged in shared silence, in the unspoken trust that the man next to you was watching your back as you watched his, that he would hear the scrape you didn't, that he'd pull you into a shell hole without a second thought. It was a bond written not in ink or melody, but in mud, fear, and the desperate, quiet will to see one more sunrise. We were bound together not by the noise we made, but by the silence we kept. And in that terrible, silent understanding, we somehow, against all odds, remained human. You know, they called us the singing division, at least in the beginning. Back in France, marching down those dusty roads, you could hear us coming from a mile away. 1,000 voices roaring out Erica or Hock off dem Gelben Wagen, the sound swelling up and getting swallowed by the countryside. It made your boots feel lighter, I swear it did. It made you forget for a few minutes where you were really headed. And me, I had my harmonica, a Hohner Marine band, a gift from my father before I left. It fit right there in my breast pocket, over my heart, a little square of polished metal and wood that felt like a piece of home. I'd play along with the singing, or afterwards, when we'd made camp, the boys would gather round and someone would request a tune, something from their hometown, and I'd fumble through it until we got it right. Those were the times it almost felt normal, like we were just a bunch of lads on a hiking trip, not soldiers with rifles slung over our shoulders. Klaus, my bunkmate, he used to say my harmonica was the company's most valuable piece of equipment, more important than the sergeant's map case. He said it kept the ghosts away. I promised myself back then that no matter how bad it got, I wouldn't let the war kill the music inside me. It was a stupid promise, the kind a boy makes, but I held on to it. That harmonica was my anchor to a different world. It smelled of my father's workshop, of wood shavings and pipe tobacco. When I put my lips to it, I wasn't in some God-forsaken field in Poland. I was in my parents' parlor, my mother humming along, the dog sleeping by the fire. It was a connection to a life where the biggest worry was whether it would rain on Sunday and spoil the football match. I'd play for the boys, and for a few minutes you'd see the same look in their eyes, that far-off gaze, and you knew they were home too, sitting at their own kitchen tables, kissing their girls goodnight. It was a small, fragile piece of our humanity, and we clung to it like a life raft. Even when things started to get rough on the drive east, the singing continued. The songs just got a little more grim, a little more desperate. We sang about the wild geese flying through the night, and you knew we were thinking about the same thing, death, and how it was probably following us. Then we got to the Volga, Stalingrad. The name itself tastes like ash and iron in my mouth even now. The singing stopped pretty quick once the real fighting started. There's no rhythm to a battle like that, no steady beat to march to. It's just chaos, a symphony of screams and explosions where the only melody is the whistle of incoming shells and the staccato of machine guns. My harmonica stayed in my pocket. At first, it was because there was never a quiet moment, never a place safe enough to draw a breath, let alone play a note. City was a nightmare of shattered concrete and twisted metal, a landscape from another planet. The smell, God, the smell is something you never forget. It was cordite and burnt flesh, the coppery tang of blood, and underneath it all, the sickly-sweet stench of corpses rotting in the rubble. We lived like rats, scurrying from one hole to the next. I remember one time, it must have been late November, the cold was starting to really bite. We were holed up in a cellar, what was left of my squad. Maybe 5 or 6 of us, plus a couple of wounded boys from another unit. The cellar was freezing, damp, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Outside, the world was ending. The Russian artillery was pounding what was left of the building above us, and with every impact, a shower of dirt and dust would rain down on our helmets. One of the wounded men, a kid with a bandage around his eyes, was moaning softly. It was a hopeless, gut-wrenching sound. And I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was just a reflex, a desperate grab for that old normalcy, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out the harmonica. My fingers were numb with cold, but I managed to get it to my lips. I thought maybe a song, any song, would be better than that moaning, better than the thunder outside. I took a shaky breath and started to play. I don't even remember what tune it was, something simple, maybe, Masai Den. The notes came out thin and reedy, a pathetic little sound against the orchestra of destruction outside. And the boy with the bandaged eyes, he stopped moaning. He turned his head slowly towards the sound. I thought for a second it was working, that this tiny piece of music was reaching him. But then he just shook his head. A slow, deliberate movement. Tears welled up from under the bloody gauze and traced clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head and started crying silently. And I knew exactly what he meant. The music was a mockery. It was a sound from a world that had ceased to exist, a world of peace and laughter and light. To bring it into this cellar, into this hell, was an insult. It was like offering a glass of fine wine to a man dying of thirst in the desert. It just reminded him of everything he couldn't have. The notes died in my throat. I lowered the harmonica and put it back in my pocket. And for the first time I felt its weight. It wasn't a comforting weight anymore. It was a lead brick, a stone from a grave. It was the weight of everything we had lost. After that I didn't play again, not in Stalingrad. The harmonica sat in my pocket, and with each passing day, as the rations dwindled and the cold tightened its grip, it felt heavier. It was a constant, cold reminder against my chest of the promise I had broken, of the boy I used to be. We stopped being soldiers and became animals, just focused on survival, on the next crust of bread, the next sip of water. The music inside me didn't die. It just went dormant, hibernating like some frozen creature, waiting for a warmth that seemed like it would never come. You'd hear things sometimes. A man muttering a nursery rhyme to himself in a corner, the sound of a spoon tapping against a tin cup in a feeble imitation of a rhythm. But real music, that was gone. The city had swallowed it whole. The surrender, when it came, was less a relief and more a final, crushing blow. The long march out of the city into captivity was a procession of ghosts. We were skeletons wrapped in rags, our eyes hollow, our spirits broken. The cold was so intense it felt like a physical presence, a white-hot fire that burned you to the bone. My feet were wrapped in strips of blanket, and every step was agony. And the whole time, The harmonica was there, in my pocket. It was so cold that the metal felt like it would fuse to my skin. It was no longer an instrument. It was a relic, a museum piece from a lost civilization. I saw other men with similar tokens. A guy next to me on the march had a trumpet mouthpiece. No trumpet, just the mouthpiece. He'd take it out sometimes and just hold it, staring at it with a blank expression. Another had a small wooden flute, broken in half. He tied it together with a piece of string. We never spoke about these things, but we'd exchange a look, a brief moment of understanding. These weren't instruments anymore. They were grave markers. They were the physical evidence of a life that had been stolen from us. The desire to hear music again was a physical ache, a hunger worse than the one in my belly. But the thought of actually making it felt like a betrayal. To create something beautiful in a world that had become so utterly ugly felt disrespectful to the dead, to Klaus, to the boy in the cellar, to all the thousands of faces that were now just frozen memories. How could you play a happy tune when you knew the ground was littered with the bodies of your friends? The music belonged to them now, and it was a funeral dirge. We were marched for weeks, it felt like. Eventually, we ended up in a camp, a bleak, barren place, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Routine was mind-numbing. A thin soup, a piece of black bread, hours of sitting in the cold, trying to conserve what little energy you had. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the barracks and the occasional cough from a man who wouldn't see the morning. One night it was particularly clear. The sky was a vast black canvas dotted with a million icy stars. There was no wind for once, just an immense, profound quiet. I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about home, about my mother's face, about the smell of fresh-baked bread, and I thought about the boys who weren't there with me. I slipped out of the barracks, away from the stinking warmth of the other prisoners, and found a spot leaning against a frozen fence post. The cold seeped through my thin coat immediately, but I didn't care. My fingers were clumsy, stiff with cold, as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the harmonica. It felt alien in my hand, a strange artifact from a forgotten time. I held it for a long time, just looking at it, feeling the familiar grooves of the metal plates. I didn't want to play a marching song, or a drinking song, or anything that hinted at joy. Joy was a foreign concept, but I felt a need, a deep, compelling need to make a sound, any sound, that wasn't the moaning of the wind or the rattling of a dying man's breath. I raised it to my lips. My breath fogged in the air. I blew softly. The note that came out was thin and wavering, fragile as a cobweb. It hung in the silent air for a second before being swallowed by the immense Russian night. I didn't play a song anyone would recognize. I just played a melody, slow and sad, that came from somewhere deep inside. It was a solo for the fallen, for Klaus, who loved a good joke, for the boy in the cellar with the bandaged eyes, for all the faces I couldn't quite remember anymore, blurred by time and trauma. I played for them. The sound felt sacred and terribly lonely out there under those cold, indifferent stars. It wasn't music to lift the spirit. It was music to acknowledge the void. It was a goodbye. When the last note faded, there was nothing but silence again. But it felt different. It felt complete. I looked down at the harmonica in my hand, then I slipped it back into my pocket. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and final as the night around me, that I would never take it out again. Some memories are too heavy for a song to carry. The weight of it against my chest was no longer a burden, it was just a fact. It was the weight of everything that had happened, a part of me now, as permanent as the scars. The music was gone, and the silence that followed was the only tribute that felt true. It was the sound of what was left. You want to know when the war changed for us? It wasn't on a map in some general's headquarters. It wasn't a date in a newspaper. For me, it was when the singing stopped. There was a time, you have to understand, when we sang. It sounds foolish now, maybe, but it was everything back then. I was a young Unteroffizier, a junior NCO, full of piss and vinegar, as the Americans say. They'd put me in charge of a handful of men, kids, most of them, fresh-faced boys from Bavarian farms and Rhineland shops who still had their mothers cooking in their cheeks. And my job, as I saw it, apart from teaching them how to clean their Mausers and dig a proper foxhole, was to keep their spirits up. We had these long, god-awful marches, your feet turning to pulp in your boots, the dust of Poland, then Ukraine, caking your throat. That's when I'd started. I'd take a deep breath, ignoring the ache in my own shoulders from the pack, and I'd bellow out the first line of Erica or Lily Marlin. First, it'd just be me, my voice sounding thin against the vastness of the steppe. But then, one by one, the boys would join in. Carl with his baritone from the church choir back home, then the others, their voices gaining strength, until the whole platoon was singing, our boots hitting the dirt road in a steady, rhythmic crunch that matched the tune. It was a kind of magic. You could see their spines straighten. The fear, the exhaustion, it was still there, but for those few minutes it was pushed back into a corner. We were a unit, a machine, and the song was the sound of that machine working perfectly. I felt a pride then, a fierce, warm pride. I was leading these men, not just ordering them. I was giving them a piece of home, a piece of the certainty we all thought we were fighting for. The brass told us morale was a weapon, and by God, we believed them. We thought discipline and spirit were two sides of the same coin, that a singing soldier was a confident soldier, a victorious soldier. That certainty, that clean, clear feeling, died in Stalingrad. Not in a single explosion, but slowly, like a man dying of thirst. It was a fraying, a relentless unraveling of everything we thought we knew. The marches into that city weren't like the marches across the open country. There were no open fields, just mountains of rubble, the jagged skeletons of buildings clawing at a sky perpetually stained with smoke. You didn't sing because the sound felt obscene in that silence, a silence that was never truly silent. It was a silence filled with the low rumble of distant shelling, the sporadic crack of a sniper's rifle, the moaning of the wounded from some ruined basement, and the constant, grinding buzz of flies. The dust here wasn't clean earth. It was a foul powder of pulverized brick, plaster, and God knows what else, that got in your teeth and tasted of death. We stopped singing on the move because moving meant darting from shell hole to shattered wall, your heart hammering in your throat, every sense screaming, your ears straining for the telltale whistle that meant death was coming for you personally. There was no rhythm, only chaos. I remember the exact moment I knew the old ways were gone. It was late October, maybe early November. The cold was starting to bite, a cruel, wet cold that sank into your bones. We'd been ordered to take a particular ruined factory workshop. We lost 5 men just getting to the starting point. I turned to the 10 or 12 grim-faced figures huddled against a crumbling wall, their uniforms caked in mud and soot, their eyes hollow. I took a breath, the way I always had, and started to say something, to give them a pep talk, to tell them we were going to show those Ivans what German soldiers were made of. The words died in my mouth. They tasted like ash. I looked at them, at young France whose hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle, at old man Becker, a WWI veteran who just stared at the ground with a resignation that was worse than any fear. What could I possibly say? That the fatherland was proud. That victory was assured. The lies we'd been fed were rotting in our stomachs, so I didn't give a speech. I just looked at each of them, met their eyes for a second and said, "All right, watch for snipers in the upper windows. Muller, you're on point. Keep low. Let's go." That was it. My role had changed in an instant. I was no longer a motivator. I was a foreman on a demolition crew, and our only job was to survive the next 10 minutes. The grand ideals had shrunk down to that one, simple, brutal imperative. Get through this hour, this day, without getting yourself or your men killed. The songs, the spirit, the managed moralate was all a child's game we'd played in a world that didn't exist anymore. After the pocket collapsed, after the surrender we heard about on crackling radios, something new emerged from the survivors who trickled back to our lines on the retreat west. It wasn't an army anymore, not really. It was a collection of broken men, held together by a new, grim professionalism. If you survived Stalingrad, you learned the new rules. A man's worth was no longer measured by his enthusiasm or his singing voice. It was measured by his silence, his vigilance, his ability to fade into the landscape. The bluster was gone, stripped away by the Russian winter and the Soviet artillery. We developed a new language, one that wasn't spoken with words. It was a nudge of a boot, a slight tilt of the head, a hand gesture so small it was almost invisible. We could communicate a world of meaning with a single glance. A raised eyebrow could say, "Ivan's listening post is 200 meters that way, 2 men probably asleep." A slight shake of the head could say, "Don't go down that trail, it's mined." This understanding was born in the cellars of Stalingrad, forged in the shared terror of waiting for the next human wave attack. You didn't need to talk about it. You just knew. My discipline changed, too. Before, discipline was about polished boots and sharp salutes. Now, it was about the discipline of quiet. I'd patrol the perimeter at night, and if I heard a man talking, even in a whisper, I'd be on him. Not with a loud reprimand, but with a hard grip on his shoulder and a hissed warning. Shut your mouth, you fool. Sound carries in the cold. You want to bring a mortar down on us. We conserved everything, ammunition, rations, but most of all, we conserved energy. Unnecessary movement was a sin. Unnecessary speech was a liability. We became listeners. You'd sit in your foxhole for hours, your ears doing the work your eyes couldn't in the dark, sorting through the night sounds, the rustle of a badger in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind, trying to pick out the one sound that didn't belong, the crunch of a boot on frozen leaves. That was the new drill. That was how you stayed alive. We developed a dark, gallows humor to cope. When a shell would land close and shower us with dirt, someone might mutter, "Another free burial," and we'd all crack a grim, soulless smile. It was the only laughter left, a bitter medicine that kept the screaming madness at bay. We were homesick, God. We were so homesick it was a physical pain, a hollow ache in your chest. But you didn't talk about home much, either. It was too painful, too distant. Talking about your mother's apple strudel or your girl's smile felt like tempting fate, like acknowledging a paradise you'd never see again. Leading these silent men was the heaviest burden I've ever carried. How do you gauge the morale of a man who hasn't spoken a word in 2 days? You have to learn to read the signs. You watch how he eats his thin stew. If he eats it slowly, mechanically, just for the fuel, that's one thing. If he doesn't eat at all, that's a red flag. You watch his eyes. Are they scanning the tree line, or are they staring into nothing, seeing something you hope you never see? I'd make my rounds, no longer the proud commander inspecting his troops, but a shepherd checking on a flock surrounded by wolves. I'd sit next to a soldier, shoulder to shoulder for warmth, and not say a word. Sometimes that was enough. Just the presence of another human being, the shared body heat, was a form of communication. I'd share my last cigarette, not by offering it with a word, but by lighting mine, taking a drag, and then silently passing it to him. That single, smouldering cylinder passed back and forth in silence said more than any speech about comradeship. My responsibility was no longer to lead them to victory. It was to lead them through an endless, bloody retreat, to somehow get them home. Every decision was a gamble with their lives. Do we dig in here for the night, or push on and risk an ambush in the darkness? Do I send a 2-man patrol to scout that village, knowing it might be their last walk? The weight of those choices pressed down on me until I felt like my spine would snap. And all the while, in the quiet moments, the ghost of the songs haunted me. The memory of those young voices, singing with such naive strength, was like a knife twist. I felt like I had lost something precious, something I was supposed to protect. The hope those songs represented, the belief in a future Rethat, was my responsibility, too, and I had no idea how to get it back. How do you rebuild a man's soul after it's been ground into the mud? You can't just start singing again. The words would stick in your throat, a mockery of everything we'd seen and done. The silence was a scar, a testament to our loss. It was the sound of truth. And in the end, as we stumbled back through Poland, into Germany, beaten and hollowed out, that silence was the only thing we had left. It was the unspoken understanding that we were not the heroes we set out to be. We were just survivors, and our only victory was that we had, against all odds, lived to see the world we'd fought for lie in ruins around us. And we did it all without saying a word. My dear Carl, I'm writing this letter to you not because I think I'll ever send it. God knows I can't. The things I need to say would only bring trouble to Mutty and Vatty if some censor's prying eyes ever saw them, but because I have to say them to someone, and you're the only one I can imagine listening. You're back home, probably still in training, still polishing your boots until they shine like black glass, and singing those songs with that same fire in your belly that I remember so well. I can picture you now, your voice loud and clear, believing every word about honor and fatherland and a future that stretches out like a perfect, sunny road. I remember that feeling, Carl. I remember it like it was a dream I had about someone else's life. We used to sing together, remember? Out in the fields behind the house, or marching with the Jungvalk, our voices young and strong and so terribly sure of themselves. "Is sitten die Morschen Nachen," we'd bellow, feeling like giants, feeling like the future itself was marching in our boots. The parades through town, the flags, the faces of the girls watching us with such admiration, it all felt so right, so powerful, like we were part of a great, unbreakable machine of destiny. I miss that feeling, Carl, not because it was true, but because it was simple. It's a painful nostalgia for a confidence that now feels like it belonged to a boy I can barely recall. And that's the heart of it, the thing I can never put into the short, careful letters I do send home. How do I describe this? How do I find words for something that has stolen words right out of my mouth? I tried to tell you about the cold. You'd think of a winter's day back home, maybe skiing in the Schwarzwald, your cheeks rosy and the hot chocolate waiting at the end. But the cold here, Carl, it's a different creature entirely. It doesn't just bite your skin. It slithers through the wool of your greatcoat, through the layers of newspaper we stuff inside our uniforms, and it settles deep in your bones. It's a cold that steals your soul, a relentless, silent enemy that kills you as dead as any Russian bullet. You wake up with your mustache frozen to the blanket, your breath a cloud of ice in the dugout, and your fingers so numb you're afraid to touch the rifle bolt for fear they might snap off like brittle twigs. And the exhaustion, it's deeper than any sleep can fix. It's a weariness that sinks into your marrow, a heavy fog that makes even the simple act of lifting your feet through the deep snow feel like a monumental task. You move through a nightmare, your body aching, your mind dull, just going through the motions because stopping means dying. That's the silence you've probably noticed in my letters, the short, empty sentences about receiving the package or thanking Mutty for the socks. It's not that I have nothing to say, it's that I have too much, and none of it can be spoken. The horror of what I've seen feels like a poison inside me, and I'm terrified that if I truly let it out, if I dip my pen in that black ink and try to describe the reality of this Eastern Front, the horror would leak through the paper and stain your hands too. It would poison your simple belief, and I can't do that to you. So I stay silent. And it's not just me. Look around at the veterans, the old hares who have been here since 41. Their silence is louder and more terrible than any song we ever sang. It's a heavy, knowing quiet that hangs over the company like a shroud. You see it in their eyes, a 1,000-yard stare that looks right through you, into some private hell they'll never leave. They don't talk about glory or victory anymore. They talk about food, about sleep, about a dry pair of socks. They talk about survival. Which brings me to the songs, Carl. You asked in your last letter why we never sing on the march anymore, why the music has stopped. It wasn't an order from some general. There was no decree read out to the regiment. It was something slower, more insidious, like a gradual frost killing a plant. It started on the long, long marches back from the Volga. We were a ragged column of ghosts, stumbling westward through the endless white, each man locked inside his own private world of misery. Someone, out of habit maybe, or a desperate attempt to grasp at the past, started to hum a few bars of Erica. The sound was thin and weak, swallowed by the vast, snowy silence. It died in his throat after a few notes. No one joined in. No one even looked up, because we all understood, in that moment, that some experiences cannot be accompanied by music. Singing requires a certain hope, a belief in a future worth marching towards. It requires a heart that still has some capacity for joy, or at least for defiance. And that belief, that capacity, was buried in the rubble of Stalingrad. It was crushed under the treads of the T-34s, frozen in the ice with the thousands of boys who will never see Germany again. To sing one of those marching songs now would feel like a grotesque joke, a mockery of everything we've been through. The words about happy comradeship and a smiling death would stick in our throats like ash. How can you sing about a smiling death when you've seen what death really looks like? I've seen a friend, a boy from my own street, blown apart by a shell, and the last thing on his face wasn't a smile. It was a look of pure animal terror. I've seen men frozen solid, leaning against walls with their eyes still open, their hands clutching empty bread bags. I've smelled the sweet, sickly odor of death hanging over a battlefield for weeks. To sing now would be to dishonor them, Carl. Their memory demands a silence more respectful than any anthem. Their ghosts march with us, a silent, countless army, and our songs are a debt we owe to them, a debt of quiet remembrance. It's the small things that break you, you know. Not the big battles you read about in the dispatches, but the intimate human moments. Like the taste of Erbswurst, that awful peas soup, day after day, until the mere smell of it makes your stomach turn. But you eat it because it's the only thing between you and starvation. Or the sound of the Katyushas, Stalin's organs, we call Themis screaming, tearing sound that chills your blood long before the rockets hit. Or the smell of a Russian village burning, the acrid smoke mixing with the scent of snow and pine, a smell that will forever be the smell of this war to me. Or the feel of a comrade's hand as you help him stumble along, his grip weak and feverish, knowing he probably won't make it through the night. That's where the war is really fought, Carl, in these tiny, terrible details. It's in the dark humor we used to keep from screaming. Like when Fritz, my bunker mate, found a single frozen potato and declared it a greater victory than taking the Caucasus. We laughed, but it was a hollow, desperate sound. We don't talk about the fatherland or final victory anymore. We talk about home. We talk about our mothers, cooking, about the girls we left behind, about the feel of a real bed with clean sheets. We are homesick in a way that is a physical ache, a deep, longing pain that is worse than any wound. We are fighting not for some grand ideal, but for the chance to go back to being the boys we once were. We fight for each other, for the man next to you in the foxhole, because he's all you have. He's the only thing that feels real in this whole nightmare. And that's why I'm writing this to you, little brother. I'm apologizing for the man I've become, for the short, empty letters that must seem so cold. Brother who went to war with a song on his lips and a head full of fire is gone. He was left behind in the ruins of that city on the Volga. What's coming home, if I ever make it back, is someone else. A quieter man, an older man, aged not by years, but by sights and sounds I pray you never have to see or hear. My hope for you, my only prayer, is that this war ends before you are sent east, that you never have to learn these same lessons, that you never have to lose your songs in the same way. Keep your voice, Carl. Keep your belief for as long as you can, because the silence that replaces it is the coldest thing of all. The brother you remember is gone, and this silent man, writing by the guttering light of a stolen candle, is all that is left in his place.